The last group of several thousand German soldiers captured in the Soviet Union was finally released in 1956, a full 11 years after the end of World War II and 7 years after the release of POWs from other countries. Hunger, cold, death marches, gulags, and labor. German soldiers fled west in hopes of surrendering to the Americans or the British rather than the Red Army, and you will soon understand why. Today we will show you what happened to them, why they were treated so brutally in Soviet captivity, and share some dark, sad, but true stories from World War II. Let's start with the fact that the Eastern Front was the largest and deadliest front in World War II, where between 30 and 40 million people lost their lives. Two words characterize this front: revenge and retribution. During Operation Barbarossa, the Germans committed various atrocities and were often merciless towards the local population. Their treatment of Soviet POWs was also horrific. Surrendering Red Army soldiers were frequently shot on the spot or sent to concentration camps, where they were starved to death or used as labor until they died from exhaustion. This created a terrible image of Germans among the Soviets, leading to brutal reprisals between the occupiers and defenders. The German atrocities against the population fueled the partisan resistance movement, and this intensified German reprisals against civilians, further fueling the hatred and resistance. Over the years of such brutal warfare, this conflict became a war of complete annihilation, with each side dehumanizing the enemy. Understandably, when the war turned in favor of the Soviets, they showed no mercy towards surrendering German soldiers. Keep in mind that while atrocities occurred, not all Germans or Soviets were brutal monsters. Most were mobilized and forced to fight for their countries. However, everyone suffered equally due to the reputation created by a minority of evil people. In May 1945, about 3 million German prisoners were in Soviet custody. The Soviet Union was the most devastated country in World War II, with a quarter of its physical assets destroyed, around 20 million citizens and 7 million soldiers dead. Because of that, German prisoners were greatly needed for reconstruction. By December 1945, the number of prisoners had decreased to 1.5 million due to gradual releases and deaths. Those capable of working were usually retained. Because of this, POWs sometimes even refused food or consumed dangerous substances, hoping to become too weak to work or be sent back to Germany sooner. Forced labor was not unique to the Soviets during that time, but what was unique was the extent to which they used POWs and the infamous Gulag prison camp system. These notorious prisons are remembered for their brutal treatment and horrific conditions. After surrendering, the journey to the camps was often the hardest and deadliest part for German prisoners. One of the most brutal experiences were the infamous death marches. They were characterized by extreme conditions that resulted in significant loss of life. Prisoners, already weakened from long battles and inadequate supplies, had to walk through snow and ice for days, with little to no shelter along the way, and often without proper winter clothing. This led to many cases of frostbite and hypothermia. Anyone who slowed down or couldn't keep up would simply be shot by the guards or left to freeze in the snow. Several such death marches stand out for their brutality. For example, the march from the encirclement at Stalingrad in early 1943 saw thousands of German soldiers forced to trek through snow and freezing temperatures. Another harrowing march occurred in East Prussia in 1945, where POWs were driven on foot towards the Soviet interior. The death toll from these marches was staggering. It is estimated that tens of thousands of German POWs died during these forced relocations. Those who survived did so through sheer willpower and often with the help of fellow prisoners, who shared the little food they had and supported each other as best they could. The survivors of these death marches arrived at the camp severely weakened, many on the brink of death, only to face further hardships. Although the gulags were initially created for political opponents, criminals, and any opponents of the regime, they became a well-established system for holding prisoners and using them for forced labor. Although not all were stationed in Siberia, as it is thought, these gulag prisons were spread throughout the Soviet Union, and there were around 4,000 of them. The main problem was food. The entire Soviet Union faced food shortages, lack of medicine, and resources, so POWs did not fare any better. Although the Soviet Union did not sign the Geneva Convention, there was an attempt to establish basic standards for holding prisoners and providing food. However, the dire economic situation often prevented these standards from being fully met, and famine was a significant problem. Until 1947, the main cause of death among German POWs was dystrophy, caused by lack of proper nutrition. Although there were no deliberate attempts to kill German POWs on a large scale, it was the harsh post-war conditions, low-calorie diets, neglect, and overwork that led to the deaths of many POWs. German POWs were also used for mining projects in difficult and hazardous conditions and places where free citizens wouldn't go. They were also forced into grueling industrial work, such as steel production in extreme heat, building roads, railways, and reconstructing cities like Moscow and Leningrad. In rural areas, POWs worked on collective farms in similarly harsh conditions. Medical care was almost non-existent, and prisoners suffering from illnesses such as tuberculosis, dysentery, and respiratory infections were left to die without treatment. The extreme weather conditions further exacerbated their suffering, with freezing winters and sweltering summers making their physically demanding labor even more unbearable. Of course, the treatment by the guards was often terrible, with frequent beatings and harassment. One German veteran recalls how Russian guards repeatedly told them they were going home, preparing trucks, lining them up, and telling them to get on, only to laugh and order them back to their barracks, saying it was just a cruel joke. However, the path to freedom was fraught with delays and uncertainty, and many prisoners would not live to see their freedom. And for those who did, the end of their suffering was sadly still far from over. The process of release was slow and bureaucratic, beginning only in the late 1940s and early 1950s, with some released in large groups and others individually. The final significant release occurred in 1955, more than a decade after the war's end. Could you even imagine being in captivity for 11 years, far from your homeland? When the POWs were finally freed, their journey back to Germany was arduous. Many were transported in overcrowded trains, traveling for weeks, while some crossed the majority of the way on foot, traveling for months. The physical and emotional toll of years in captivity was evident. Many POWs still wore the remnants of the same uniforms they had been captured in, with mismatched shoes and ropes holding their uniforms together. The Germany they returned to was vastly different from the one they had left. Now occupied by the Allies, there was no honor in being a German soldier, and they were often mistreated by drunk Allied soldiers in their hometowns. Families were scattered, homes destroyed, and the economy in shambles. The returning POWs, weakened by years of malnutrition, disease, and forced labor, faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives, often unsuccessfully. Many became alcoholics, completely shattered by their experience. Many returned to find their families had moved on or perished during the war and its aftermath. One soldier remembers approaching his village and hiding in the woods for 2 days, scared to go to his house, uncertain of what and who he would find there. When he saw an old woman walking to his house, He recognized his mother and ran to her, but she thought he was a Russian soldier and screamed, thinking he was going to attack her. It took a moment for his family to even recognize their son and brother. Many families did not know for years what had happened to their sons, husbands, and relatives, and many were already written off as killed or missing in action. Years of inadequate food, harsh labor, and poor medical care had left them with chronic health issues. This is just a small part of the collective suffering of millions during a terrible, bloody war that forever changed the world and showed what humans are capable of doing to each other.